Sometimes I can speak loudly. I've got kids. Well, thank you guys for having me today. It's a real pleasure. And while you're having some snacks, I found some of our old renderings from some of our buildings that we have out in the back. And we recently celebrated our 75th anniversary a couple years ago, and so I created a timeline that's also a fish measuring sticker. I will say, I printed it a month before Texas Parks and Wildlife changed the sea trout limit. So use your Sharpie and correct it. So that's why we haven't distributed them broadly, because they're not quite accurate. But they're a cool sticker, and everything else is accurate. So if you're fishing for red drum, flounder, you should be good to go. But this is just an aerial shot of the Institute, and it's a really pretty photo. But this one, I think it's a little bit more realistic and easier to see the full breadth that the University of Texas has here in Port Aransas. We own 72 acres, and we like to call two different campuses. So we have our Channelview campus, which is what you might be familiar with the Patton Center, and then we have the Port Street campus over here. The Channelview campus is where the bulk of our facilities are. So we have our marina right here, and the marina houses our research vessel Katie that takes school groups out, and it also has several private boats that we rent those slips out to pay for the maintenance of the marina. But our property line goes all the way down to this is Beach Street, and then we lease, or we have a long-term agreement with the Port Aransas ISD of the track, and then Nueces County takes over from there. And then I also just wanted to point out, so if you're driving down Cotter right here, this is our Beach Street housing, so we have lots of construction going on. This is construction that we're finishing up the final phases of after the hurricane, so we're redoing or we're building new housing for our graduate students and our undergrads. So we have two big construction projects that I'm sure everybody has seen. One are the Wilson Cottage expansion over here, and then we have a dormitory on this side. So it's construction on either side, which is challenging. I'll also mention the Port Street campus. So the Port Street campus, we have our Fisheries and Mariculture lab over here. It's right by this. This is the ferry landing, to give you some orientation. And we've got several laboratory facilities there, and that's also where our big broodstock are. So we have broodstock, which means the really large fish that we use for our big females. So we use them to rear, spawn eggs, and then use those eggs and juveniles in our experiments. And so those really big broodstock, the red drum, are about this big. They're huge, and they're kind of like puppies because they're well trained now. They come when it's feeding time. So it's a really good, if I take VIP tours on there. But I didn't know quite how to start with the history of the Institute, so I decided to do chronological order. So I'm not really going to be focusing on the research discoveries, which are vast. I'm really going to try to hit some of the milestones in terms of facilities and construction, but the research milestones would qualify for an entirely another talk. But I just wanted to give you an idea of how we came to be. So in 1892, the University of Texas Board of Regents made a report to then Governor Jim Hogg that they thought the Gulf of Mexico was unique enough that there should be some sort of marine station. But it didn't really happen until May of 1900. And UT has a really good archive for the Board of Regents meetings that go back to the beginning of time. And they've all been digitized with OCR, which I can't remember what that stands for, but essentially takes all this cursive and turns it into searchable text, because this is how all their notes were. Which is challenging to read, but at least they have them and they're archived. So in May of 1900, the Board of Regents designated $300 to build a marine station in Galveston, and then the 1900 hurricane hit 2 months later and wiped everything out except for the steamer vessel that was there. They tried again in, let me see if I put it there. So in 15 years later, the University of Texas Regent, George Washington Breckinridge, donated he had a yacht, and he also donated $500 to outfit that yacht, but then a tropical storm came through before that could even be put into place and wiped that one out. So nothing really happened for a while. And also, fun fact, so Breckinridge also donated a whole bunch of land to the University of Texas. So if any of you are from Austin or know about Austin, there's the big Breckinridge Field Lab that is associated with the University of Texas. So he did a lot for UT. And he also is the one that named Alamo Heights because he was a big banker in San Antonio. But what really happened when the UT was established in Port Aransas was in 1935, Dr. E.J. Lund, was investigating what we now know as a red tide. So there's a big giant fish kill, and he came down to check it out and kind of stayed. He thought this was a really great place to be able to research the marine environment, and then essentially lobbied the University of Texas to support this endeavor. And they were happy to do so, but then World War II came on. And so there was a slight pause, but we were formally founded in 1941. But things didn't really start rolling until 1945. So sometimes our established date is a little bit wobbly. But 1941 is when we were designated by the Texas State Legislature. And in doing so Dr. Lund bought 10 acres of land and donated it by also the Port Aransas mayor. And he brought his student Gordon Gunter, who was then, he became a director after Dr. Lund. He was the second director. But I wanted to point out, so just prior to Hurricane Harvey, this is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineer building, and Cliff is very familiar with this building and can talk a lot more in depth about it than I can, because I know what it is, but that's about it. Yeah. So there also used to be a big railroad that I have a picture on it, but we turned this into a dormitory up until Hurricane Harvey, demolished it, and we had filled it in it was a lab for a long time. So E.J. Lund came down, he used this space as his laboratory, and it was a lab for, 50 years or so. And then we started putting K through 12 students in there. But it had a lot of big creosote pilings, and then all this got filled in. I also wanted to point out, so there's a big water tower here, because in the next shot, not quite this one. This one I wanted to show you the railroad system that was used to ship out the granite to construct the jetty. But you can kind of see the engineer building and the tower, and some of those were still standing up until Harvey. But this is the picture that we use a lot, because it has the 4 main buildings that populated the Institute for about 20 years, from about 1940 to most of 1960. But this is the engineer building. This was another dormitory, and the base is where the water tower was. So they just reused the substantial base of the water tower, and they put a dormitory there. This was the director's house with a small lab as well. And then we had another small dorm, and then a lab on the pier. This got taken out by a barge. Rick, do you know when that happened?
I'm not sure which one that was. I can't remember.
Yeah. So Rick Cockey in the audience is also a longtime colleague.
I lived in that building, that engineer building, for 6 weeks when I moved here. 72.
So if there's questions I can't answer, rest assured, Rick is here to save the day. But this was the original pier that got taken out by a barge. We had another pier that got taken out by a barge, but that was after Harvey. I just thought this picture was kind of cool because our marina is right here, and this is just old Port Aransas before a lot of the streets had and development has been built up yet. I also wanted to mention, this never gets mentioned, but Dr. Lund's wife was Dr. Hilda Florence Rosine, and she was a longtime colleague with Dr. Lund. He was her professor, and then they got married after about 20 years or so. And she was integral in a lot of the research that he did while he was here. And she doesn't get recognized like I feel like she should, because she's the one that also donated their original house, which was this on the left. It did get demoed after Harvey. But with the endowment, she also bequeathed the land and some funding to support additional research. This is what the Lund looks like right now. So the house is still called the Lund, but it's much nicer and much newer. We just got finished about a year ago. But this is just a shot of probably about 1960 era of one of the laboratories. You know, the researchers that came here tended to be physiologists, so they were really interested in how animal systems work and function. And as such, there was also lots of animal collection. And all of our fish collections, we had a very substantial fish collections. They have all gotten moved to the main campus up in Austin it's called the Pickle campus. And I don't know why it's called Pickle. But there's a really big fish repository there that they combined it with other amphibians collections that they had from other researchers up on the main campus. So all of our fish collections are still in repository, and I saw them actually about a month ago, and it's quite impressive. They have millions of different species up there. This is their pier station, and you can kind of see these are what we call wet tables. So anytime you have tanks on a big wet table, especially if you're using flow through, so you have seawater that comes in and goes out, depending on what type of experiment you're trying to do. It's very helpful to have a wet environment, and we still use lots of wet tables today in different facilities that we have. I just want to also point out that Dr. Lund created the Publications of Institute of Marine Science. So this is I don't want to say this used to be a thing, because I think it still is, but when you had graduate programs, one of the ways that they kind of made their mark on science was to create a publication or a journal in that frame. And so Dr. Lund started that, and it got changed. The name changed to Contributions to Marine Science. We don't do it anymore, but it lasted for several decades. But that was a really big deal because it really helped archive and create all of the discoveries that the researchers were making. So this is just a shot of what the library has transitioned over time. It's been in several different buildings and locations, and now it's in an elevated site, and it's a little bit nicer. But in 1960, that's when a lot of the construction that made the university what it is today started happening. So Howard Odom was the director at that time, and he secured the funding to really create the next big expansion of the university. So they started with some saltwater ponds, and we actually still have a couple of these. These are ponds in our animal rescue, Amos Rehabilitation Keep, that we have a metal building that's over them, so you can't quite see them, but there's sea turtles using them. They've been refinished several times, but we're still using them today. And then at this time, we also acquired the other big tract of land that helped support the 72 acres that we have today. In addition, we started building some new housing. So this was we call this Beach Street. And that's one of the pictures over there. This is what it actually looks like in black and white. And it used to be called Married Student Housing when I came in as a student, but now it's just Beach Street. I don't know why it was called Married Student Housing, but it was. But it's kind of like a big concrete block, but it has one of the best views in Port Aransas, especially the third floor. It's really impressive. But that really helped us bring in more students that were staying here full time. So as a graduate program, our students stay and live here for about anywhere from 3 to 6 years. And so it's really important that they have housing, especially now. Before it used to be that it was important to have housing so that they could be close to the laboratory and get their work done. But now it's even more important to have housing that is subsidized because Port Aransas is very expensive, as you all well know. That's also when we built the one of the main laboratories. And so this is, right now, this area, it's kind of like a hole. That's where we have the Lyceum. So if anybody's been to the Institute, there's like this real big window of rooms that goes across like the driveway. And that got filled in over time. And all this got filled in too as we needed more space. The whole bottom floor started getting filled in. But this is the administration room. My office is right here. So it's kind of funny. And this is just another shot of all the construction that occurred. And this is construction on our dormitory. So we used to have pre-Harvey, everything's pre-Harvey, but pre-Harvey we had two little dorms in the back that got, three dorms on the channel side that got demoed. And then we had one bigger dorm on the Cotter Avenue side. So if you've ever been to the Patton Center, if you look across, there's kind of a building right there. Sometimes the students hang towels out there. That's where the undergraduates are. And so they're building a dormitory there. We are, since we had to demo those 3 dorms after Harvey, so we're building a new undergraduate and K through 12 dorm, which will run perpendicular to that site as well. And that's supposed to be finished April. We have students coming in May. So it has to be finished very soon. But this is just a cool area shot. Once during this big expansion, that's when also they dug the marina. And the marina is very important because we have lots of research vessels now, and they started acquiring research vessels as well, such as the Longhorn. So the Longhorn was an 85-foot vessel that, since it was here for a very long time, for about 3 decades, and it was recently, well, it's not recent anymore, but it feels recent. It was retired in 2006. It just became too expensive to maintain, and we also didn't have a ton of research that was going out. So what happens when you have a big research vessel for university is that you can put it into this system called the UNOL system, and that's a system that allows other universities and researchers to rent it. And it's very important to sustain the maintenance fees for that, because you want it rented most of the time. It's like anything. And for whatever reason, the Longhorn wasn't getting rented that much, and the upkeep was just very extensive. So, but I saw Dan Parker. So there's a lot of legacy here. But Dan's father was Pat Parker, and he was one of our directors. And so Pat Parker was responsible for getting the Longhorn at the time. But yeah, there's a lot of legacy here in Port Aransas, so I'm proud to be a part of. But the Longhorn was, when we received it, it got cut in half, and Rick can tell you this story, but we cut it in half and lengthened it, and did a lot of major modifications to it. The longer horn, and then the shorter horn. Next to the Longhorn. That was when Bevo came. And then Bevo came again, so we have there's actually 2 pictures of the Longhorn with that. But We had a skinny bevo when I was there, but also in 1974, Dr. Rick Tenen who started our informal education program. And that's the one that, if you read about it in the South Jetty, that I wrote about, because the informal education program, the purpose of that is to get K through 12 and community education groups out into the local environment and to better understand and experience what marine science is and to appreciate it. But Dr. Rick Tenen started that program, and we've maintained it since that time. We also built the Visitor Center, which is now the Patton Center, named for Bobby and Sherry Patton, who were philanthropists to that renovation cause. It was also, we used a lot of money from the NOAA Disaster Recovery Fund, but it was originally built in 1981, and so that's also what the rendering is on the table, is of the original Visitor Center. And the Visitor Center used to have our old library in there and in the auditorium, which it still does. But the library got moved to a new building, and we moved that space into what we call the Estuary Explorium. And so that's the area, if you've been in there, that don't have any aquariums. They have lots of interactives for kids and adults. But also moving forward as we get closer to our present time, in 1983, that's when Drs. Connie Arnold and Joan Holt found the recipe for rearing red drum. So this was a big deal in Texas and the world, but they figured out how to spawn red drum in captivity, which led the groundwork for Texas Parks and Wildlife to spawn and release, or spawn, raise up to juvenile and release red drum into our local bays and estuaries. And that work with red drum continues today. So red drum are, people care about red drum, so that's why they get used, but they're also really unique because they're estuarine species, which means they can live in kind of fresh to brackish to salty water. They can live in lots of different environments, which makes them very handy for experiments. But related to that, in 1987, so Connie Arnold was working with the National Marine Fisheries. So Connie was the one, Connie and Joan Holt, who's, Joan Holt was a professor, now she's a professor emerita, so she's still in town. But in 1987, that's when the Fisheries and Mariculture Lab got turned over to the University of Texas. So it used to be National Marine Fisheries, and then they transferred that land and the building to UT. And with it, Connie just became a UT employee as well. So that was very helpful as well. But this is the area that if you're going on the ferry, if you look to your left, those are all those buildings right there. And we've expanded upon those. But in 1990, we then expanded to become a graduate program. So before we just had researchers coming down to Port Aransas and doing their research full-time and part-time. But then when we had the graduate program, then we had some of our researchers turn into faculty. And so they were teaching a graduate program, a master's and a PhD. And this is what some of the first cohorts, I don't think she's here. Oh, she's at a meeting. But so Dr. Sharon Herska was she was a master's student and then a PhD student, and she was working in Mexico for about 20 years, and we recently hired her as one of our professors. So it's great to see Sharon back in town. And I think she gave a talk last week at our public lecture series, so she's wonderful. We're very happy to have her back. And Rick might notice this one. So this is the LASGAS, and I just had to throw this in here because as a shout out for archiving. When I was doing a lot of research during our 75th anniversary, I was trying to find as much information as possible. And there's a lot of good material that UT has. So we have the Call Day, which is the Texas Exodus magazine. They have a really good archive. The South Jetty has an archive. The Board of Regents has an archive, but then UT has this newsletter of the LASGAS with these great mastheads so this is Rick Tenen, this is Rick Coggy sitting in the second row, second chair. It's really informative newsletter, and to find out dates of what happened, and it's super interesting to go back and read about all the different research trips, and it's got a little comedic twist to it. So it's fun to read, and it's available online. But moving forward in 1999, so Tony Amos was a researcher with us, and he did a lot of his research in the the Antarctic. But he was also really interested in marine life and keeping it sustainable and rescuing shorebirds and sea turtles in particular. So he founded what is now the Amos Rehabilitation Keep. It used to be called the Animal Rehabilitation Keep, but we renamed it in his and his wife Lynn's honor. But in 1999, we built one of our facilities called the Turtle Building, and so this was the dedication ceremony associated with that. And then, we kept building a couple new buildings. So in 2005, we had the SEA lab. So we had a warehouse that SEA donated for us, and they put a really big sign on it that people could see coming across the ferry. So CCA wanted to one-up them and donated a brick and mortar building, and so we have two. So one was more of a warehouse style, but we need all kinds for fish, and we also have a CCA lab for larval culture, and we have that's Dr. Joan Holt that I was mentioning before. So we do a lot of rearing of larval fish, because if there's any sort of environmental change or impact to the fisheries, if it's going to impact the fish, you're going to see it in the juveniles. And so that's where almost all of the research occurs, which is kind of helpful because you can have smaller tanks. And you need lots of repetition. So it usually all happens in the larval species, and this is a larval red drum. I think it's 3 days post-hatch, maybe. But then in 2006, something near and dear to my heart that I helped get designated was the Miss Aransas National Estuarine Research Reserve. And so this is a federally funded, with a state match, research and education program. And the Miss Aransas Estuary is the bay system just north of here. So just past the channel, if you're looking to the North Jetty, then that whole complex is the Miss Aransas Estuary. It goes from the jetty essentially here to the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge and that bay system. But it's a really unique bay system. It's fairly pristine. So you have the city of Rockport that's kind of in the center, but everything else is relatively rural and kind of protected by the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge. So all of those habitats are a good place to understand natural versus human-induced change. And so we have a lot of stations out there that are monitoring water quality and terrestrial habitats as well. And then in 2010, associated with that, we also built the Bay Education Center in Rockport. If you haven't been, I would highly recommend it. We're open Tuesday through Saturday from 10 to 4. And we have this really cool Science on the Sphere, which is a global projection system, and they run programs out there every day at 2 p.m. It's all free of charge. And then we have exhibits that talk about the bays and estuaries. And we've redone it twice after Hurricane Harvey. And I know this looks like an old picture, but it's the only one I had of the construction. But this is our Estuarine Research Center. This is our newest lab building. It's if you ever drive around the campus, it's the one that looks a little bit, the architecture is just a little bit sharper. It's not just a block. It's got a little bit, a few slants and features, but it's still a block. But the Estuarine Research Center, it provides space for the Miss Aransas Reserve, as well as an additional expansion for the university researchers as well. So the Miss Aransas Reserve is such that all of its employees are UT employees, but they're not faculty, but they do more research and informal education. So it's slightly different. But then in 2017, so this is kind of similar to the Missions Reserve, but it's a little bit harder to grasp because it is a long-term program that's happening in the Arctic. So we have the Beaufort Lagoon Ecosystems, they call it an LTR for short, long-term ecological research program. And it's very similar to the Missions Reserve in that these are both federally funded programs, and the purpose is on long-term monitoring and research. That is very expensive and very hard and very important to do, because if you're trying to understand change in any way, you want to see what the data is happening long-term. So we have a local program that's funded by NOAA in the Missions Reserve, and then we have one in the Arctic that's funded by the National Science Foundation. And that program is run by Dr. Kenton Dunn, and UT is the lead on both of those big systems, which is a big feather in our hat. Okay, so then it's Harvey. So Hurricane Harvey hit us really hard, and we've since repaired every single roof, I think? Yeah, almost every single roof. And most of our windows, just all the envelopes to places. And I'm trying to think of what our $1 million count is, but it's probably 75 million that we're looking at. And we're still repairing and rebuilding with the construction projects, but I don't know what the pros are. The pros are that things happen, you know. With it came a lot of opportunities, so we brought in $20 million of grant funding, which is pretty substantial, and we're getting to repair a lot of deferred maintenance that should have been done before. But we had moved all of our equipment into, we were doing a big HVAC project, and we moved all the equipment into the new building, and the new building's roof ripped off, and so we had I think our equipment bill was like $7 million. We had one instrument that was $1 million instrument, and it was just toast. So it was really challenging. It was really challenging for the faculty and students, if you can imagine. So the students' research just essentially stopped, and we had lots of delayed graduations and things like that. And then we had COVID right after that. So they're very resilient. We'll say that. But because of Harvey, we have new opportunities, and we were able to put together the Patent Center. And so if you haven't been, I'd highly recommend it. It's an upgrade, if you could say, very much so. And I just wanted to throw in a few, this is my research. So we've done lots of amazing, amazing things. And so one of the things that I think that resonate with people is that we had Dr. Peter Thomas, recently retired, and he had a lot of really transformative research that directly impacts human health. So he discovered this novel hormone receptor on a fish egg. And essentially what happens is before you have a fish egg cell, and before they thought that the hormone progesterone would just diffuse through the cell very slowly, and they couldn't really figure out why. But he found this receptor that essentially slingshots this hormone into the cell. And that's really important, because when you have this hormone receptor that goes awry, that's what happens in ovarian and breast cancer. And so a lot of his discoveries were immediately put into the medical field, and that's part of what, like, chemotherapy will, if you have a progesterone related cancer, they can target that particular receptor, and that's how that you get that really targeted chemo. And that's directly from a sea trout that he found. And he's also looked at, since then, he's found many, many other receptors. You know, hormones regulate so many different things in your body, and if you can figure out several of the steps how they work, you can then use that to target different drugs and drug systems. So it's been incredibly impactful, and we're really sorry he's retiring, but everybody deserves to retire. But we've been doing lots of other things. So we have another researcher that has transformed the tree of life. So before he found this, it's called archaea. And so when I was in grade school, I didn't even know what archaea was, but archaea is something that is not really a bacteria and not really a protozoa, but its own thing. And humans are more closely related to archaea than bacteria. And it seems very obsolete, but he's able to, through this new mechanism, look at these archaea and figure out things that are unrelated to what you would normally think. So like oil-eating archaea, he can figure those out, and then they can get applied to oil spill discoveries. So it seems very esoteric, but it is impactful. And then we have a lot of oil spill research, speaking of oil. So the Deepwater Horizon presented a lot of money in the Gulf of Mexico, and we had led a really big consortium on one of those, and we had partners on others that were looking at oil impacts to fish, and also the microbes that eat the fish. And then another big thing we're doing is lots of microplastic work as well right now. So plastics and southern flounder, those are kind of like the two big things that are happening. But I think I talked a little bit about these, but the university has, since we've been around for a long time, we've been doing lots of stuff for a long time. But just to point out within the community, the Deep Sea Roundup tournament we've been involved with as waymasters and behind the scenes, working on that for decades, as well as the Amos Rehabilitation Keep with the shorebirds. But then we have lots and lots of educational programs that have been going on, some of them since the 70s. And then most important to researchers and resource managers like Texas Parks and Wildlife, Texas Water Development Board, all of those organizations, is that we have lots of data. And we have data that is spanning 10 years plus. And so all of that data gets sucked up into systems, and they find new trends and programs that are working on. And then coming up, a couple new things that we're doing. So in 1977, we had a St. Croix Marine Station. I don't know what happened to it. Maybe Dan Parker knows, because that was in his dad's reign. But we're since doing a kind of a similar partnership with a company called Ovis, and this is in the Isle de Carmen in Baja, and our researchers are going there next month to try to lay the groundwork. There's already an MOU, a memorandum of understanding between the two organizations, and so we might be able to send students and have some of them come here as well. So those things still, partnerships with different areas still occur. And then we have a lot of construction going on right now. So aside from the housing, we're renovating some of the lab buildings. So we have a really nice big new lab space that will come online at the, this summer that will focus more on the toxicology. And so I hope that we'll get our chair position in there as well. And that will all come online this summer. This is the construction projects that I was talking about that you can see if you're driving by. And this will give us about 44 new bed spaces for the dormitory, which is it's needed for sure. And then these are the Wilson Cottage expansion. So this is also going to be a really big benefit because housing for our graduate students is very crucial to the expansion. So we've been very successful in our researchers getting funding, and with funding comes bring in more students, but we need somewhere to put them. And then we're also building the ARC Rescue Center, and I hope that this will be done in August as well. And this will provide a real dedicated space for our rehabilitators to work on sea turtles and shorebirds before they were working in an old lab. And so now it's a space built just for them. And the newest thing is that we have funding from the Texas State Legislature. We have additional funding to do research for the Texas coast. And so I just issued a bunch of requests for proposals, and so that's essentially a competitive request. And we're trying to get them to our researchers here to work with local and state agencies to address problems affecting the Texas coast. And then also think that's the impact 2030. So we're looking at short-term impacts, but then also think about long-term impacts on the Texas coast and work with our colleagues up on the main campus in Austin. And so we want them working with the dietitians or the Jackson School for Geosciences or these other somewhat strange partnerships to really move the needle forward in terms of discovery and thinking forward. And so all those grants are coming through, and we'll issue about, I don't know, $4 million worth of grants for that. And then we have a new vessel. So we're replacing we're not replacing the Longhorn. Nothing can replace the Longhorn, but we have a new vessel. And if anybody's been out the marina, it's very similar to the Captain Murchison that Texas Parks and Wildlife has in our marina right now. And it is it's got a hydrofoil system, so it can go a lot faster, and it's much, much more fuel efficient. And it's also very stable. And so we're in the design phase of this, and I hope that we'll be able to get it done in about 1.5 years. But they haven't given me a timeline. That's just what I'm hoping, that they get it done. But so that's what we're really looking forward to. That's the next big thing. And I think that might be my last slide. Yeah. Yes.
Are there tours of the Port Street facility?
Okay, so the question is, are there tours of the fisheries laboratory where they raise the eggs? There's not yet, but I'm working on them. I'd really like for them to do that, and I'm working on it. Do what? Yeah, so like K through 12 groups will go through, and I can do VIP tours, but I don't have a designated one. I've got to kind of twist the arms to sometimes do it. Yes, sir.
Fish farming in the Gulf?
No. So the question was, is there much fish farming in the Gulf? No, not really. And I don't know why. I would imagine that there's a lot of regulations that make it challenging to do so, because most of our mariculture farming happens on land. So there's a shrimp mariculture and oyster mariculture on land, and there's shrimp near Aransas Bay, and then Port O'Connor, there's some oyster endeavors that are starting, but on the in the bay systems or in the Gulf, not so much. Oh, there you go. Yeah.
And back when Jeff Kaiser worked with a group of people offshore, that they would put netting around rigs, and they had redfish inside those rigs. I think it was redfish.
But it was too hard. Or too.
One was just like 12 miles an hour.
Yeah.
And charter fishermen, it was just like a deer feeder. It was feeder getting
Right.
off. If you're there fishing, you got a lot of
No, Jeff worked on that, and he could explain that very well, because they drove on it, did all the work, and then they were required to move it, and the storm hit or something, and it was a big mess.
It sounds challenging because it's just so rough. Back in the back. Are we studying the mangroves, and are they coming back? Yes. So Katie Swanson, who is our interim manager of the Mission Reserve, has been doing a long-term study of mangroves, and she's more interested in range shifts, like are they moving northward, which they are, but they are coming back from the hurricane.
But they do come and go with freezes.
Right.
Knock them back and nothing's just
Yeah. So after the winter storm Uri, they really had a big dieback, but those ones are coming back for sure. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm.
It
Oh, thank you for the recommendation. Yes.
Do you have a ballpark figure for maybe the size financial impact on Port Aransas each year?
Each year? No, I did have the Economic Development Administration when I was doing we have a Seacoast building, and I asked them to do a rough order of magnitude for money brought back in, and for that one building, I think it was $7 million for like a $2 million investment. So it's quite substantial. We used to say for state funding, for every dollar of state money, we'd bring in $5 of federal funding. So what we are able to get those sorts of money because so the university, our money comes in lots of different pots. So we have the state appropriation, and then we have, it used to be called line item funding. So we get that pot of money, and then that's what we can say is state funding. And then all the grants that our researchers bring in, most of those are federal. And so we can say we're bringing in X number, and it's always higher than a 1-to-1 ratio. But for tourism, that's harder to figure out. Yes, sir. Yes.
They're self-sustained.
They are self-sustaining. I paused because, yeah, so spotted sea trout are declining. Yeah, no, spotted sea trout are declining, and southern flounder are also declining. And both of those populations, we have lots of research to try to figure out why, but there's no one answer for sure. But red drum are, they're in the 80s, when black and red drum became very popular, they were allowed to have commercial and recreational fishing, and the commercial fishing fished them down to a pretty low level. And the state of Texas put the ban on commercial fishing, and since then they've been increasing. But that's also when Texas Parks and Wildlife started to stock the efforts as well. Texas Parks and Wildlife also stock sea trout and flounder as well, but the sea trout and flounder aren't as hardy, kind of, would that be fair to say, Rick? Aren't as hardy as flounder and sea trout. Red drum are.
I'm curious, that picture of Tony Amos, the turtle setting and all that,
Mm-hmm.
that lady in black hair, was that Lady Bird?
Oh my gosh.
She was on the board at one time, and that looked like Lady Bird Johnson to me. Right there. That dark hair, right here on the light.
Right there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's Lady Bird Johnson there.
Well, yeah, because that's Edith, and I don't know who this gentleman is, though. Huh? Nice.
Ken, what's his name? He made a comment one time that, it's nice to have a bird on the board.
Well, our board so we have a Marine Science Advisory Board, and it was created by Edith, who is this woman right here, and Charlie Butt, who's the owner of HEB. They together decided that we needed a board and cajoled all their friends, and since then it's grown to a healthy membership of 55 with several life members. So they meet twice a year, and we're very happy to have them because they're also big donors and philanthropists. Yep. Yes, sir. In North Padre? Yeah. Oh, well, I personally think we need all the wildlife rehabbers we can get. And part of the reason is because the ARC can only handle so much. And the ARC has been the primary rehabilitator for so long that it's primarily donation based. We do have a little bit of grant money that goes into it, and our big substantial grant funding is going to cycle out in next year or so. So we only have so much capacity. And the number of green sea turtles is increasing, which is a great thing, but they're also staying here longer. And so when you have these really big cold events, a lot of times you'll have cold stunning, and it's just all hands on deck. So the more the better, in my opinion. I mean, there's always, human population is not decreasing anytime soon, and the interactions with life will continue to increase. So yeah, we're happy to have them. And we also have a partnership with San Antonio SeaWorld. So they take a few of them, but they can't do nearly as many as we would need them to. We work with them in partnerships, like if sending them turtles, especially during cold stuns. So, once our space fills up, then they all go either to the Port Aransas National Seashore or to the aquarium. Yep. But yeah, no, the rehabilitators and both sites work very closely together. They're all on the same hotline. Yes, sir. Where do graduates typically find positions? So it's kind of split. Before it used to be that people graduating with a master's or a PhD would continue on the track of academia. And that's still the case for sure, that they go on and be a postdoctoral fellow and then try to get a faculty position. But we also have master's degrees and PhDs that are going into the resource management field. So they'll be working with organizations such as Texas Parks and Wildlife or foundations. And so, for example, locally, we have several graduates that have stayed in Port Aransas. We have Ray Mooney, who is the Nature Preserve manager, so she's one of our graduates. And Dr. Kirsten Stanzel, who is the director of the Coastal and Basin Estuaries Program. So she's local as well. So those are some non-academic tracks. And Colleen Simpson, the director of the Parks and Rec, was our coastal training program coordinator for a while. So.
A lot of Peter students go into the medical field. It's amazing how many people do that.
Yeah, so Peter Thomas is one of our physiologists, and those students can go, everywhere as well. So, and then we have students that go into the Navy and are working with the Department of Defense as well. So it kind of depends on what their particular research is and where they'll go. But EPA, yeah.
Do you find more students coming into this type of study or less, or how does that compare?
I think the number of students is fairly stable. What has changed is the demographic. So there are our graduate students and the undergrads that are coming through, there's a lot more women than there have been. Like you look at the grad students and it's 80% women. There is a disconnect between the graduate student field and making it up to the faculty level. So faculty and director positions tend to be much more heavily male. And so it'll be interesting to see how long that takes to shift. But there is a lot of effort for making that shift, at least within the University of Texas.